many of us, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a house with a mother and a father. For, well, a good 13, 14 years of my life, I was able to live with a mother and father who loved each other, and that was pretty much how I learned about marriage, is that my mom and my dad are married to each other, they loved each other, they love each other, excuse me, they had us, they love us, and so that's what marriage is. Around about grade 8 or 9, that's when my mom and my dad sat me down and said that they were going to get a divorce. I'd heard them fight on and off a couple years before that, and they got into arguments, but I never really doubted that they loved each other. But when they said that they were going to get divorced, it was a bit of a shock to me. I really didn't expect that these people who I really thought loved each other would choose to go away from one another. So when I was about 14, instead of living with my mom and my dad, I started living with only my mom, and then my dad went to live elsewhere. And so for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been living with my mom, and I've barely seen my dad. It's really hard for a kid going through divorce, as I'm sure some of you might know. But going through divorce wasn't overwhelmingly negative. There are 3 positive things, or enlightening things, that I learned from my parents' divorce that I just wanted to share tonight. The first thing that I learned is that God made everyone completely individual. Now, I know for a fact that my mom and my dad loved each other, and they still love each other. However, that does not mean that they always get along, or that they like each other 100% of the time. They would get into arguments, and they would disagree, and they both had their own failings and faults that would get in each other's way. And that's because God made each and every one of us an individual. And that means that sometimes we can have relationships with other people that are amazing. God can put 2 people together and they can be married until they die, until the end of time. And sometimes God can put people together and it's not that great. People can argue, people can disagree, people can even do pretty bad things to each other. But that's just because that's who we are as people. We are individuals, we are unique, there is no one else like us, and sometimes when you put that together, it doesn't add up. So I learned that my mom and my dad are 2 very different people, just as we all are very different people. But the second thing I learned is that just because my mom and my dad left each other doesn't mean that they don't love each other. Now this might be different for other kids who have gone through divorce, but for me, I know for a fact now that the reason that my mom and dad left each other is because they love each other. They couldn't stand to make one another unhappy. They couldn't stand the fact that their fighting and their differences were not only hurting us, but were hurting each other. My mom and my dad left each other because they didn't want to hurt each other anymore. So that is where I learned that just as complex as people are, just as individual as we all are, we can love each other in the weirdest of circumstances. My mom lives in Halifax, my dad lives in Sydney. They still love each other, but they just can't live together. And the third part is, divorce sucks. It sucks a lot. I've gone, poor me, but divorce was honestly very hard on my mom, very hard on my dad, very hard on my sister. It was hard on me. I've been struggling to deal with it for the past 5 or so years, and it's affected me, thinking about marriage, thinking about relationships, commitment, how I see my family in general, but it's also affected me in positive ways in those regards. Now I see, because, as I said, mom and dad left each other because they love each other. Now I've come to understand my mom and my dad as the 2 individuals that they are. I realize that my mom's an incredibly strong person for not only making this decision, but also to stay in the house, to work, to support me, to continue to love not only me and my sister, but my dad as well. And I love her to death, and I still love my dad because try and leave someone that you love because you have to. So if it's taught me anything, it's taught me that people are different. People can love in the craziest of circumstances. And divorce sucks, but it's not the end. That's about it.